what, 11, 12 stomach ulcers. I live with Renee.
For years, fans have wondered what really happened behind the scenes of Gordon Ramsay's kitchen nightmares. What made one of TV's biggest stars walk away from his most successful show? The truth behind its sudden end in 2014 has been hidden for more than a decade, buried under network explanations and media speculation. But now, at 58, the Devil Chef finally opens up about the real reasons that forced him to pull the plug on one of television's most popular cooking shows. His revelation is shocking and sheds light on a decision few could have anticipated. This isn't the story you thought you knew. The birth of a television empire. Back in 2004, nobody could have predicted that a hot-headed British chef would become one of television's biggest stars. Gordon Ramsay was already making waves in the restaurant world. But when Kitchen Nightmares first aired in the UK, it was different from anything viewers had seen before.
Começou na Inglaterra. Ok, pensava que a primeira vez tinha sido nos Estados Unidos. Afinal, não. Foi na Inglaterra.
The concept was simple yet brilliant. Take struggling restaurants that were on the verge of closing down, send in Gordon Ramsay with his no-nonsense approach, and watch as he transforms these failing businesses into successful establishments. But what made the show truly special wasn't just the restaurant makeovers. It was Gordon's raw, unfiltered personality that captivated audiences worldwide. When Kitchen Nightmares crossed the Atlantic and launched in America in 2007, it became an instant hit. Viewers couldn't get enough of watching Gordon tear apart terrible food, challenge lazy staff, and rebuild restaurants from the ground up. The ratings were through the roof, and everyone thought this success story would continue forever. For 7 years, Kitchen Nightmares dominated television screens across America. The show earned multiple award nominations, including Best Reality Show Recognition in 2008, 2009, and 2012. Gordon himself was nominated as Best Host by the Online Film and Television Association. Everything appeared perfect on the surface, but behind the cameras, something was starting to change. The early success masked the growing problems that would eventually lead to the show's shocking cancellation. While viewers at home were entertained by Gordon's fiery outbursts and dramatic restaurant transformations, the man himself was beginning to feel the weight of constant failure.
Bem, ele... Esquece, ele quando se passa, mano, o gajo tipo é furacão autêntico.
What most people didn't realize was that despite the hard work and television magic, most of the restaurants weren't actually being saved. The statistics were heartbreaking. According to reality TV updates, a staggering 82% of the American restaurants featured on Kitchen Nightmares eventually closed their doors for good. This means that out of every 10 restaurants Gordon tried to save, only 2 would still be operating years later. For a perfectionist like Gordon Ramsay,
Então, este pode ser o verdadeiro motivo pelo qual o Gordon Ramsay encerrou o programa.
these numbers weren't just disappointing, they were soul-crushing. But the real story of why Kitchen Nightmares was canceled goes much deeper than simple statistics. Gordon Ramsay finally reveals the truth behind the show's end, and one particular restaurant experience that pushed him beyond his breaking point. The dark side of restaurant rescue. While millions of viewers enjoyed watching Kitchen Nightmares every week, Gordon Ramsay was living through experiences that would eventually drive him away from the show entirely. What appeared on television as dramatic entertainment was, for Gordon, a series of increasingly frustrating battles with restaurant owners who seemed determined to fail. The problem wasn't just that restaurants were closing after Gordon left, it was how quickly many owners would revert back to their old, destructive habits.
Lá está, é isto. Muitos donos, quando o chefe saiu do restaurante, voltaram para as práticas antigas, as práticas que os levaram à ruína e a deixar o restaurante como estava.
Despite receiving complete makeovers, new menus, staff training, and Gordon's expert guidance, countless restaurant owners would throw away everything the moment the cameras stopped rolling.
Exato.
Gordon began to realize that no amount of his effort could fix certain fundamental problems. Some owners were simply not cut out for the restaurant business. Others were dealing with personal issues like addiction, depression, or financial troubles that ran far deeper than what could be addressed in a week of filming. The emotional toll on Gordon was immense. Here was a chef who had built a culinary empire through dedication, hard work, and an uncompromising commitment to excellence. Watching restaurant after restaurant fail despite his best efforts was like watching his own reputation crumble in slow motion. But perhaps even more troubling was what Gordon was discovering about some of the restaurant owners themselves. Behind the scenes, away from the cameras, he was encountering people who seemed more interested in the publicity than actually saving their businesses.
Também outro motivo.
Some owners would put on a show for the cameras, pretending to care about change, only to reveal their true attitudes once filming wrapped. The stress was taking a physical toll as well. Gordon would later reveal that he suffered from food poisoning multiple times while filming Kitchen Nightmares.
Como assim o chefe tipo sofreu de comida envenenada? What the hell?
Eating at the struggling restaurants wasn't just unpleasant. It was actually dangerous to his health. The combination of poor food handling, questionable ingredients, and unsanitary conditions meant that every meal was a potential health hazard. As the years went on, Gordon found himself dreading certain aspects of filming. The initial excitement of helping struggling restaurants had been replaced by a growing sense that he was fighting an uphill battle against impossible odds. The question wasn't whether Gordon could fix these restaurants. The question was whether these restaurants could stay fixed once he left. This growing frustration was building toward a breaking point. The restaurant owner nobody expected. By 2014, Gordon Ramsay had encountered every type of restaurant owner imaginable. He dealt with stubborn chefs, delusional owners, and completely incompetent staff members. But nothing could have prepared him for the encounter that would ultimately lead to Kitchen Nightmares being canceled.
Opa!
The restaurant in question was situated in a remote ski resort in southern France. On paper, it seemed like a typical Kitchen Nightmares case. A struggling establishment that needed
Para a França?
Gordon's expertise to turn things around. The owner was a British man who had somehow convinced himself that running a restaurant was easy money. What Gordon discovered when he arrived was far worse than the usual problems he'd grown accustomed to solving. This wasn't just a case of bad food or poor management. This was a restaurant owner who was deliberately taking advantage of his customers because he knew they had nowhere else to go.
What?
The location of the restaurant made it a captive market. Guests staying at the ski resort had limited dining options, and the owner had apparently decided that this gave him license to serve substandard food at inflated prices. He wasn't failing because he didn't know better. He was failing because he simply didn't care. When Gordon tried to address these issues
Só criou o carcanhol.
using his usual direct approach, he encountered something he'd rarely faced before: complete and total resistance. The owner wasn't interested in Gordon's feedback, wasn't willing to acknowledge problems, and seemed to view the entire Kitchen Nightmares experience as nothing more than free publicity for his resort. For Gordon, this was the ultimate insult to everything he stood for as a chef and businessman. Here was someone who was not only wasting his time, but actively disrespecting the very customers who kept him in business. The owner's attitude represented everything Gordon hated about the restaurant industry: laziness, greed, and a complete disregard for quality. The filming process became increasingly tense as Gordon realized he was dealing with someone who would never change, no matter how much help or guidance he provided. This wasn't a case of someone who lacked knowledge or resources. This was someone who lacked basic integrity. As Gordon would later reveal, this particular restaurant owner wouldn't even trust him to run his bath, let alone operate a restaurant. The experience was so fundamentally different from what Kitchen Nightmares was supposed to represent that it forced Gordon to question whether the entire concept of the show was still worth pursuing. Little did anyone know, this moment of frustration would lead Gordon Ramsay to make the unthinkable decision: the breaking point. After spending a full week filming at the French ski resort, Gordon Ramsay reached his absolute breaking point. The experience had been unlike anything he'd encountered in 7 years of making Kitchen Nightmares, and it would prove to be the final straw that convinced him to walk away from the show entirely. The restaurant owner's attitude had been problematic from day one, but it was his response to Gordon's criticism that truly sealed the fate of Kitchen Nightmares. Instead of being grateful for the help, or at least respectful of Gordon's expertise, the owner actually had the audacity to give Gordon attitude for telling him the truth about his failing restaurant. This was the moment when Gordon realized that some people simply cannot be helped, no matter how much time, energy, or resources you invest in trying to save them.
Verdade.
The owner was perfectly content to continue serving terrible food to trapped customers, and no amount of television intervention was going to change that fundamental character flaw. Gordon woke up one morning in the middle of filming, looked around at the situation he'd found himself in, and had a moment of absolute clarity. He was done. Not just with this particular restaurant, but with the entire concept of kitchen nightmares as it existed. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He'd spent 7 years of his life trying to save restaurants. And for what? In that moment, Gordon, he was going to cancel his own show. Not because the network wanted him to, not because the ratings were dropping, but because he could no longer stomach the emotional and physical toll that Kitchen Nightmares was taking on his life. The French ski resort experience had crystallized everything that was wrong with the show's format. Gordon was pouring his heart and soul into helping people who, in many cases, didn't actually want to be helped. He was risking his health and reputation to save businesses that were often doomed to fail, regardless of his intervention. For someone who had built his entire career on excellence and success, continuing with Kitchen Nightmares felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. The show that had made him a television star had become a source of constant frustration and disappointment. But as Gordon Ramsay finally reveals, the decision to cancel Kitchen Nightmares wasn't just about one bad restaurant owner. It was about a pattern of experiences that had convinced him the show's original mission was no longer achievable. The phone call that shocked everyone. When Gordon Ramsay made his decision to cancel Kitchen Nightmares, he didn't go through agents or lawyers or carefully crafted press releases. He picked up the phone and called Fox Broadcasting Company directly to deliver the news. The conversation, as Gordon later revealed, was both awkward and telling. Fox executives couldn't believe what they were hearing. Here was one of their most successful shows, with solid ratings and a devoted fan base, being canceled not by the network but by its own star. The network's response was exactly what you'd expect from television executives faced with losing a profitable show. They tried to talk Gordon out of his decision, suggesting that maybe what he needed wasn't cancellation, but just a break. After all, taking a hit show off the air is never good for business, especially when there's no obvious reason for the cancellation. But Gordon's mind was made up. He'd reached his limit, and no amount of negotiation or compromise was going to change that. The network executives found themselves in the unusual position of trying to convince their star to keep making a show he no longer wanted to make. What made the situation even more challenging for Fox was that they couldn't simply replace Gordon and continue the show.
Claro.
Kitchen Nightmares wasn't
Programa
just
era
about
dele.
restaurant makeovers. It was about Gordon Ramsay's unique personality and approach. Without him,
E não só, o programa também foi dele. Foi ele que inventou o programa. Ele levou o programa até aos Estados Unidos.
there was no show. The network's attempts to find middle ground revealed just how valuable Kitchen Nightmares was to their programming lineup. They weren't ready to let go of a proven hit, especially one that had been performing well and showed no signs of declining popularity among viewers. Fox executives tried every angle they could think of. Maybe Gordon just needed a longer break between seasons. Maybe they could reduce the number of episodes per season to make filming less demanding.
Também era possível.
Maybe they could change the format to make the experience less stressful for Gordon. But Gordon had already thought through all of these possibilities, and none of them addressed the core problem that had driven him to his breaking point. The issue wasn't the filming schedule or the workload. It was the fundamental futility of trying to save restaurants that were often beyond saving. The phone call marked the end of an era for reality television. Kitchen Nightmares had been more than just a show. It had been a cultural phenomenon that turned restaurant rescue into must-see TV. Now, suddenly, it was over, and nobody at the network had seen it coming. As Gordon would later admit, canceling his own show was a decision that would haunt him for years. But at that moment, it felt like the only choice that made sense. Little did anyone know, Gordon's decision to cancel Kitchen Nightmares would leave a void that the television world was desperate to fill, and set the stage for an attempt to revive his restaurant rescue legacy in a whole new way. A failed replacement. Fox Broadcasting Company wasn't about to give up on the Gordon Ramsay restaurant rescue format without a fight. After 3 years of trying to convince Gordon to return to Kitchen Nightmares, they finally managed to talk him into creating something new, a show that would supposedly address all the problems that had led to the original cancellation. In 2018, 24 Hours to Hell and Back premiered with great fanfare. The concept seemed promising on paper. Gordon would still be rescuing failing restaurants, but with significant changes to the format that were designed to make the experience less frustrating for everyone involved. The most notable change was the timeline. Instead of spending a full week at each restaurant, Gordon would have just 24 hours to complete the entire transformation.
Caraças, 24 horas só, meu!
This condensed schedule was supposed to eliminate the prolonged exposure to problematic owners and unsanitary conditions that had contributed to Gordon's burnout on Kitchen Nightmares. The show also featured Gordon going undercover initially, allowing him to experience each restaurant
Ramsay, undercover. Por modas, este homem é conhecido a nível mundial.
as a regular customer before revealing his identity. This approach was designed to give him a more authentic view of what customers were actually experiencing, without the
Olha, isto era uma estratégia que deviam de ter usado logo de início no conceito. Entrar tipo undercover e perceber e ver realmente como é que eles tratavam os clientes, como é que eles tratavam os funcionários, como é que o chefe era, como é que o dono era, etc. Era um conceito também que acho que deviam de ter utilizado quando iniciaram isto em 2007.
artificial behavior that often occurred when restaurants
Porquê? Porque obviamente ao saber que o chefe está no restaurante vão tipo mudar para uma postura melhor, eles não serão aquilo que são no fundo na realidade. Eles vão mostrar ser umas pessoas que não são. Porquê? Porque sabem que está lá um chefe de renome, que tem câmeras a gravar e que o país todo está a ver o que é que está a acontecer.
staff knew they were being filmed for Kitchen Nightmares. But despite these format changes, 24 Hours to Hell and Back never managed to capture the magic of the original Kitchen
Claro.
Nightmares.
24 horas, é.
Critics and viewers consistently complained that the new show felt overly scripted and artificially dramatic. The 24-hour timeline that was supposed to solve problems actually created new ones, making the transformations feel rushed and unrealistic. Viewers who had loved Kitchen Nightmares found themselves disappointed by the replacement show. Online reviews were harsh, with many people describing 24 Hours to Hell and Back as a poor substitute for the original. The shortened timeline made it impossible to develop the kind of compelling narratives that had made Kitchen Nightmares so engaging. More importantly, the fundamental problems that had driven Gordon away from Kitchen Nightmares hadn't actually been solved. Restaurant owners were still difficult to work with. The failure rate was still high, and Gordon was still exposing himself to health risks
Então é
by
24
eating at
horas?
these establishments. The ratings told the story of a show that never found its audience. While there was initial interest, likely driven by nostalgia for Kitchen Nightmares, viewership declined steadily with each season. By the third and final season, the show had lost 35% of its audience compared to season 2. After just 3 years, 24 Hours to Hell and Back was quietly canceled, leaving Fox without any Gordon Ramsay restaurant rescue programming for the first time since 2007. The failed replacement had only showed how special Kitchen Nightmares had been, and how impossible it was to recapture that magic with a different format.
Exatamente.
The
Lá está. Manter a essência do programa.
pandemic changes everything. Just when it seemed like the Kitchen Nightmares chapter of Gordon Ramsay's career was permanently closed, the COVID-19 pandemic changed everything. The restaurant industry was devastated by lockdowns, capacity restrictions, and changing consumer behavior. Restaurants that had been thriving for decades suddenly found themselves on the brink of closure. The pandemic created a level of restaurant industry crisis that hadn't been seen before. According to CNN, about 10% fewer restaurants were operating in the United States in 2023 compared to 2019. Thousands of establishments that had survived recessions, competition, and economic downturns couldn't survive the pandemic. For Gordon Ramsay, watching this industry-wide devastation stirred something he hadn't felt in years: a genuine desire to help restaurants in crisis. These weren't failing businesses run by incompetent owners anymore. These were good restaurants run by hardworking people who were struggling through no fault of their own. The pandemic had created exactly the kind of situation that Kitchen Nightmares was originally designed to address. Restaurants that needed
Lá está, este era o...
help, not because they were poorly managed, but because they were facing unprecedented challenges beyond their control. Gordon began to see an opportunity to return to the original mission of Kitchen Nightmares, but with a complete
Ou seja, ele sempre gostou isso e sempre sentiu saudades do pesadelo na cozinha. Tanto que eles até disseram que durante anos o facto de ele ter encerrado o programa tipo, foi uma espécie de uma assombração para ele. Ele viveu muito tempo com isso.
completely different context. Instead of dealing with lazy owners who didn't want to change, he could help dedicated restaurateurs who were desperate to save their
That's not
life's
better.
work from circumstances completely outside their control. The timing felt right for another reason as well. Gordon had spent nearly a decade away from Kitchen Nightmares, during which time his perspective on the restaurant industry had evolved. He'd continued to expand his own restaurant empire, giving him even more insight into the challenges that restaurant owners face on a
Bonito,
daily
Tarant.
basis. The pandemic had also changed viewer expectations. People were more sympathetic to struggling businesses, more aware of how fragile the restaurant industry could be, and more interested in seeing success stories during difficult times. For Fox Broadcasting Company, the combination of Gordon's renewed interest and the perfect cultural moment for restaurant rescue programming was too good to pass up. The network that had spent years trying to replace Kitchen Nightmares suddenly had the opportunity to bring back the original. But Gordon's return. The pandemic had taught him valuable lessons about which restaurants were worth saving and which ones were beyond help, knowledge that would prove crucial in avoiding the frustrations that had originally driven him away from the show. The return. When Kitchen Nightmares returned in September 2023 after a 9-year absence, it was clear that both Gordon Ramsay and the show itself had learned important lessons from the past. The new season represented more than just a comeback.
Então calma, o programa realmente voltou em 2023, portanto recentemente, há 3 anos. Mas a minha questão agora é, será que ainda hoje se mantém? Ou terminou? Vamos ver. Agora fiquei curioso de saber.
It was a complete reimagining of what restaurant rescue television could be. The most significant change was in Gordon's approach to selecting restaurants. Instead of focusing on establishments that were failing due to owner incompetence or laziness, the new Kitchen Nightmares prioritized restaurants that were struggling despite having dedicated, hard-working owners.
Assim sim, ok. Portanto, a ideia que ele teve após a Covid-19 manteve-se. Ir para restaurantes que realmente tipo, as pessoas merecem, mas estavam a ter dificuldades financeiras, que não estavam a conseguir mantê-los de pé, mas não porque eram maus. Não porque eram maus, é porque são bons, mas têm dificuldades. Boa. Isso só lhe vai ajudar a consumir menos energia, a ficar menos cansado, a nível psicológico é muito melhor e também vai tornar o trabalho dele mais fácil.
Shift meant that Gordon was less likely to encounter the kind of resistance and attitude that had driven him away from the show in 2014. The pandemic had created a perfect opportunity to focus on restaurants that deserved to be saved. These were establishments with good bones, passionate owners, and real potential for success. They just needed help navigating the new challenges of the post-pandemic restaurant landscape. Gordon also brought a different energy to the new season. The years away from the show had given him perspective on what aspects of restaurant rescue
Foram 9 anos.
were most important and most achievable. He was still demanding and direct, but there was less of the explosive anger that had characterized some of the earlier seasons. The production style had evolved as well, taking inspiration from the original UK version of Kitchen Nightmares. This meant more focus on genuine problem-solving and less on manufactured drama. The timing of the return couldn't have been better. Viewers who might have been skeptical about helping obviously failing restaurants were much more sympathetic to establishments that were struggling due to circumstances beyond their control. Early episodes of the new season received positive reviews from both critics and fans. The success stories felt more achievable and sustainable than many from the original run. Restaurant owners seemed more grateful and receptive to Gordon's help, creating a more collaborative atmosphere than the adversarial relationships that had characterized some earlier episodes. Perhaps most importantly, Gordon seemed to be enjoying himself again. The passion that had driven him to create kitchen nightmares in the first place was back, fueled by the knowledge that he was helping restaurants that truly deserved to be saved. But just as his passion reignited, Gordon was ready to confront the deeper truth behind the show's downfall, a truth that went far beyond any single restaurant or owner.
Oui.
The final truth. At 58, Gordon Ramsay finally reveals the complete truth about why Kitchen Nightmares was canceled, and it's not what most people expected. While the French ski resort incident was the final straw, the real reason ran much deeper than one bad experience with a difficult restaurant owner. The truth is...
Então não foi o principal motivo, houve outro motivo por trás. Claro, o que aconteceu nesse restaurante francês na instância de ski foi só tipo a cereja no topo do bolo, mas já tipo já eram coisas já acumuladas de antes. Ok.
That Gordon had been questioning the entire premise of Kitchen Nightmares for years before he finally pulled the plug. The show's 82% failure rate wasn't just disappointing. It was proof that the format itself was fundamentally flawed. Gordon realized that 1 week of intervention, no matter how intensive, simply wasn't enough to fix the deep-seated problems that...
Nenhum restaurante consegue ser tipo mudado a 100% em uma semana. É impossível. Sobretudo aqueles restaurantes em que têm donos que são teimosos, donos que não aceitam a mudança, donos que são tipo iludidos, que acham que o seu restaurante é o melhor do mundo, mas está na merda. É isso. Uma semana para este tipo de restaurantes não dá. Mas assim, para aqueles que têm dificuldades financeiras, mas que são bons, uma semana se calhar é suficiente, ok? Mas para restaurantes maus, que precisam mesmo de ajuda a nível de tudo, financeira, de staff, de comida, etc., uma semana não chega.
Plagued most failing restaurants. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was the effect on Gordon's own reputation. Every restaurant that failed after appearing on Kitchen Nightmares reflected poorly on his credibility as a chef and business advisor. He began to worry that the show's high failure rate was damaging his brand and undermining his other business ventures. The decision to cancel Kitchen Nightmares was ultimately about protecting his integrity as a chef and businessman. Gordon realized that he couldn't continue endorsing restaurants that were likely to fail, regardless of how entertaining it might be for television audiences. It's time to tell everything, as Gordon now admits. The show that made him a television star had become a source of professional embarrassment and personal frustration. The return of Kitchen Nightmares in 2023 revealed Gordon's attempt to reclaim the show's original mission while avoiding the pitfalls that led to its cancellation. Whether this new approach can succeed where the original format failed remains to be seen, but Gordon's willingness to be honest about the show's problems suggests he's learned from past mistakes. What do you think about Gordon's decision to cancel his own show at the peak?
Espero que tenham gostado aqui deste vídeo sobre o Gordon Ramsay, o motivo pelo qual ele encerrou o pesadelo na cozinha em 2014. Espero que tenham gostado. Não se esqueças de subscrever o canal e de ativar as notificações antes de tu ires embora, porque é importante, porque eu assim conseguirei chegar ao meu objetivo de 1000 subscritores até final do ano. E para isso eu conto contigo. Um grande abraço, abreijos e fui. Obrigado.